Good morning, Robertson Wesley and people who are joining in for the Seeds of Change series and its natural evolution. I'm so excited to be sharing with you like this. Just for context and history, Reverend Karen Bridges asked me a month ago now to start a series that looks at the basics of how we can kind of analyze and make meaning and understand the current world events, and what are some ways and approaches of looking at COVID or Black Lives Matter movement or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all these movements and concepts that are around and really in our lives in all kinds of capacities. So what are some ways of looking at it and moving forward with nuance, or moving through with nuance? And just some recap, and I'll put this in the comments. This is about part 5 of this. I have done 3 other Facebook Lives and then also a Zoom meeting to talk about accountability, which wasn't recorded. It was for the folks that attended. And then this will be about call-out culture, cancel culture, and some alternatives to that method. And then next Wednesday, we'll have another Zoom meeting about biases and expectations. So I'm just going to now put this link in. So this has evolved, and some context for who I am. I am the Justice Artistic Director with Robertson Wesley. Those links did not go through. So the links are videos as part of the Spirited Arts Movement series. So if you're on this page, you can go back and watch the past videos. And you can also watch Laura Foster, who's the Healing Artistic Director, and the Open Art Studio that she's been doing throughout the COVID pandemic online. But this series has evolved from me attempting to be participatory with folks, increasingly into a lecture series where I give some basics, some basic theory about kind of what's happening. What is call-out culture? What is intersectionality? What are some ways of looking at current conflicts within the world, and getting into ways of knowing intercultural understandings. So you have a culture, you have a way of moving through the world, and how does that relate to other people's ways of moving through the world? And just kind of an overall umbrella. I am not making these things up. They're theories, and I really draw from Michel Lebaron. And today I'll be drawing more from the internet and a great book I love called Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman. It came out in 2016. And today will really be, I will ask a few questions, but I'm going to try to keep it a simple lecture format where I share what call-out culture is. But first of all, because I am a facilitator, how are people today? What are you kind of chewing on? And if you can note that in the comments, that would be great. Also, any questions you have, you can email to me at brooke@rwuc.org, or message me and that kind of thing. I do wish for this to be a conversation. And I really welcome your feedback and comments for other things that you would like to know more about, or have a conversation with other people about in the Seeds of Change atmosphere. Okay, so yeah, any questions? How are you today? It's the first one I will ask you. And I'll just recap. Biases and expectations. Just for my own transparency, because that's a thing for me, this is an organic way of moving through, so I am planning each session as we go. So if there's something from this session that emerges that you want to know more of, that you're curious about, we can continue to do sessions for whatever makes sense for yourself and community. Things you're curious about are really important for me to have that combination. So I wanted to do a primer, an introduction on call-out culture and cancel culture. And I don't know how many people are viewing right now. 4. Hello, 4 people. Please note how you are today. Please engage in the conversation however you wish. And I will ask a few questions, but this one I tried to keep succinct and more me talking. Okay, so this thing called call-out culture, which in my research I've discovered has evolved to being called cancel culture. And the alternative, which we'll talk about, is calling in as opposed to calling out. That's that combination. So I wanted to start off with a quote from Sara Ahmed, and she coined a phrase called feminist killjoy, which I have identified as, and people have tattooed on them. It's become kind of a catchphrase. So what is a feminist killjoy? And a poetic thing that she's noted as saying is to kill joy is to open a life, to make room for life, to make room for possibility, for chance. And my quick understanding of how she means a feminist killjoy is someone who speaks truth to inequity, speaks truth to things that don't make sense, that have been unspeakable before. So coming in and being a feminist killjoy is to ask questions and to raise voice to inequities in the world. And I wanted to start our time together with this quote because what I've seen about call-out culture is the overall theme of call-out culture is it started in, like many of the things we've been talking about, in feminist campus culture, so university, undergrads, that kind of activist world. And there's been a concept creep into the mainstream of some of these words, like call-out culture or cancel culture. But it came from the feminist idea of calling things out for inequity. And it's just another kind of turn. So I wanted to just very quickly recap some of the other things we've spoken about and how this fits into them. So you're a person in society, you have personal experiences within a structure. And in that you have what I understand from social work is a social location. So you are a series of things that you have decided for yourself or not decided for yourself. Some of the things we don't decide for ourselves is the race we're born into, the nationality we're born into, the mother tongue that we have. Those are things that are given to us based on circumstance. And then there's things also that can come, such as able or disable. Turn off the dinging on my phone. And but yeah, you're given a social location. So you're a person in this matrix and web of society, and then you have to engage with the ways that you're part of dominant culture or you're part of marginalized culture. And dominant culture is what has set up a framework. And most of our policies and institutions and ways of being benefit a dominant culture and not a marginalized culture. And then from there, there's levels of conflict. And the best way to quickly describe levels of conflict is, you may have heard, fights about the dishes are never about the dishes. So by just making it be about dishes is a material conflict. But in that, you're having a conflict with a person or a nation state or a group of people. And then underneath that is how do you make meaning? How do you make sense of things? What's important to you? And so when we're always just trying to call out self-conflict in a solution-focused way about dishes, we're not getting at the deeper conflicts. And then, yeah, the ways of speaking and making sense of the world. So how do we own our interpretations of what's happening through using I statements? And then how do we also honor in ourselves ways of knowing that aren't just in our mind? And I know I can only speak for the own culture that I grew up in, but this real bias, and we'll talk about biases in the next session, of intellect, of concrete factual truth, and something I've discovered personally and professionally, that if you're not addressing people's feelings or emotions or embodiment of a conflict, you often can't move through it because that person doesn't really feel fully seen or understood. And we also have a culture, I'm going to say like a white liberal culture in Canada, that is quite afraid of emotions, quite afraid of yelling. We'll get at that a little bit today. And again, these are basics and generalizations, so your personal experience, maybe you're fine with yelling. And I'm making a cultural generalization that there's a culture in Canada that is really afraid of anger and afraid of direct action and afraid of kind of that type of conflict. And by being afraid of that and trying to keep everything on an intellectual or material level, we can't get through things because people don't feel heard when their emotions aren't met or understood, or embodiment, or spiritual connection. And some other cultures address this better, but also we don't wish to fetishize other cultures' ways of being in a way that isn't fair to those cultures. And that's a whole other conversation that we haven't even gotten into. So those are some of the other things we talked about. Just a quick recap. And now, are there any questions about that, about our recap? If there is, please let me know if this is your first time joining, and I will repost those links for the previous ones in the thread afterwards. So what is call out, call in culture? My first question, which I'll just copy and paste from my notes, are, do you have experiences of being called out or called in? Is this something that you're already very familiar with? Has it gone well for you or not? And you can also privately message me as well. The irony of asking people about their call-out experiences publicly is not lost on me. So, call the basics. So call out, or what is evolving to be called cancel culture, is mostly a social media phenomenon, and occasionally in person, of publicly announcing when someone states or says or does something problematic. And maybe just to unpack the word problematic. So I know this word rather colloquially through the campus activist cultures when I worked for a University of Alberta organization called APERC. And I would say problematic is when someone may not be checking their privilege or saying something that, and we'll unpack the word checking privilege as well. So saying something as a universal statement or an opinion that isn't taking into account a more nuanced understanding. And this is kind of an ironic thing to mention in call-out culture. So if I say something that is a microaggression for racism, what would be, okay, I'll use an example. So if a white person has dreadlocks, and they deeply defend those dreadlocks, someone may find that problematic, that a white woman has dreadlocks, and a white woman sees nothing wrong with dreadlocks. So that, we're going to use that as an example. So we see that as a problematic thing. And they announce on Facebook or Instagram, like, I'm allowed to have dreadlocks, I love Black culture, it's beautiful and wonderful. So what can happen in that statement is then people quickly comment in her thread, in her Instagram thread of this fictional person, that person is racist, that person doesn't understand Black hair culture, that person isn't honoring the history and oppression of Black hair, that Black women who have dreadlocks often are seen as unprofessional, and it's cultural appropriation and all of that. So in this fictional example, people jumping quickly onto a comment thread to tell someone that they're problematic would be a very simple example of call-out culture. And the problematic aspect is at the root of it. So I see something that isn't entirely cool, and then I jump on and let that person know. So another thing that happens in this, and I'm going to use the white girl dread example, is that it's also stepping in for others. So it's seen as an act of allyship for me as a white person to jump on and say, hey, other white person, and my typing gesture, hey, other white person, just to let you know your dreadlocks aren't cool. And the understanding of that in call-out culture, which we'll jump into the cons of this and the pros of this, but is that myself as a white person is going to take on the labor with the other white person so that people of color don't have to do this emotional labor. They don't have to defend themselves to white people because that's seen as exhausting. So it's a form of allyship. And again, we'll get into why this may not be appropriate. But what is call-out culture is it's a form of allyship or a personal ability to have a voice, an agency to tell other people what they're doing isn't so cool. And it also has a point of education. So my example of the white girl dreads jumping on and being like, hey, just so you know, your dreads are seen as a point of cultural appropriation, and maybe you should consider not having them and finding other ways to value Black culture. That would be a polite and nuanced way of calling out. So what can happen when this occurs, depending on where these people are at in their learning journeys or unlearning journeys, is it can escalate very quickly. And then it can include shunning. And this is what Sarah Schellman's book, Conflict is Not Abuse, really describes very well happens in social media culture. So my example, I jump on, I tell fictional white girl that her dreads aren't cool and she should take care of them. And then another person does that and they jump on and say, yeah, I agree with Brooke. You should really, but they might be a bit harder about it. They might say, cut your hair, like you're not being cool and you should stop defending your choice this way. And then maybe that person, which is really natural, feels defensive and jumps on, and all of a sudden you have a social media online fight, which I'm sure you've witnessed and seen many times. And then what can happen is people decide to block the offensive person and stop talking to them. And what I've also seen, and this has happened to me, is there's not even a dialogue. So for instance, most recently in my social media kind of ecology, a man was being really mean to a friend in a private message, and my friend jumped on publicly and said, hey, this person is a royal asshole and they're not being accountable for being an asshole. And then there was a campaign in the comments to unfriend this person, and then I didn't unfriend them, I just was kind of observing, and then I received a private message from someone I don't even know that well that said, hey, you should unfriend this jerk. And I did, because I don't know them well enough to get into calling in or restorative action. So all of a sudden a person who might have had defending a public call out, gets shunned on Facebook media. And Sarah Schellman talks about this happening many times. So an interpersonal conflict between two people that becomes escalated, becomes public, and then a community will shun different bodies in that, whatever they agree or disagree with. And sometimes in that interpersonal conflict becoming public, words like abuse or some of the symbolic aspects can come in, and we haven't talked about that yet. So what I've witnessed, and this is me kind of jumping out on a limb, sometimes symbolic conflicts come in to interpersonal and they're there, but they can make it really hard to solve it. So with my white girl dread example, so I call out a white girl and I say, hey, your dreads aren't cool, you should do something about them. And I might use all kinds of different language to say that. And then someone may come in and say, your defensiveness is abusive to Black people and we're not going to be your friend anymore. And again, that kind of stepping in for others. And it can make, and then the white person gets called racist, and it can be really hard to move through a conflict if symbolic social location stuff gets put into it right away. And it may be totally right. That person may be very racist, and may need to be called out on being racist. But it's adding symbolic levels to conflict that can make them in the moment very hard to change. And Sarah Schulman speaks of that. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the pros and the cons. So something that's come out of my explanation, I'll also explain just a little sidebar of checking your privilege. So you may have heard this, like, yo, check your privilege. And what this means, if you're told to check your privilege, and you probably won't be told that way, but what it means, like, to be privileged is you're part of the dominant culture and the world is designed for you. Again, an example I used in the past was being left-handed. Things are physically designed for you, is my non-political thing. So it's very rare to find tools in our lives that are designed specifically for left-handed people, just because we're not a dominant culture. So that's an example. So this is a dumb example, but so if you're right-handed, I might say, like, hey, check your privilege. Like, you've never had to think about how to adapt to using something in a left-handed way. Or checking your privilege often, where I've really witnessed it, is regarding class, ableism, things like that. So just like what it means is to be mindful of ways that the world is designed for you and meant for your preferences. And so if you're angry about something not being right for you, or you have an opinion about something, just to be mindful of it. Yeah, and there's many aspects of this and different models. Maybe two, if you're someone who learns from examples. Why am I thinking about this? I was in IKEA recently and looking at cutlery, and I own an inherited, like, very heavy duty, expensive set of cutlery. And I was saying, like, oh, I have a preference towards heavier cutlery, and the person I was with said, hey, like, that's totally a class thing. Not everyone can afford, like, $500 worth of cutlery, and you should, like, watch yourself that way. And it was said really kindly. So I was like, oh yeah, you're right. Like, sorry, that's totally my privilege that I was able to have this expensive thing and not everyone can. Which is maybe a great example of how to respond to being called out. So if you're asked to check your privilege, check inside yourself, like, where is that coming from? And we'll get into that in a moment. So that's the basics. And the other kind of basic definition I thought I would give is tone policing. So this is getting at a cultural preference for non-emotional communication. So if someone's yelling or emotional with me with something, I might ask them to stop yelling at me because I can't hear them if they're yelling. But sometimes things make us emotional. They're upsetting, they're very personal. And so how can we hear things even if they're being screamed at us in a way that is hard to hear? I find with tone policing, it's really dependent on a culture and a consenting. So especially if you're building a safe container, you need a bit of time for people to really take on emotions, or compassion, or the right people, and that's tone policing. So pros of call-out culture. I wanted to speak about this first because I feel like right now call-out culture, we've swung, and now if you look up on YouTube, and I have a clip I'll post in there, it's all about why call-out culture is bad. So I wanted to speak first about the pros of call-out culture and where it came from. So a good thing about calling things out is it's a quick way to feel like you're doing something. And I think something interesting in the radical or liberal communities, and I'm going to use an example here of if there was someone on your Facebook thread, or for some reason you stumbled into the internet world of, like, Ben Shapiro and the alt-right movement, or a few years ago there was an alt-right rally in America, and people took, and a way of activism was to dox those people. And doxing is when you publicly expose someone who might have really problematic views, like being the alt-right or believing in white supremacy, and they may not obviously let their employer know. So if someone was at a white supremacist rally and you dox them, it means that you take their photo, you find out who they are, you post it on the internet, you post where they work, you post where they live, and you expose them. And I wanted to say that this is a pro of call-out culture when we look at like neo-Nazis or white supremacy and some really dark edges of the world and people's belief structures. And it's calling those people out or doxing them, we see is needed because they have harmful beliefs. And we wish to build a level of consequence for those people. So you believe in white supremacy? Maybe you shouldn't be working at XYZ. It's consequences for your actions. It's and I use specifically the neo-Nazi aspect because that can be a pro of call-out culture. It also allows community members, so if you exist in a community, whether on the internet, the worldwide community, or a smaller community, to feel like you're holding a line regarding your values. So if you worked, for example, when I worked at the university campus for APIRG had very distinct values in anti-oppression, in feminism, in intersectionality, and looking at all these analyses. So if your community has decided in that way, in a more formal way, such as a strategic plan, you're deciding together as a community what your values are. And by deciding what your values are, then you're holding each other accountable, and it can feel good because you as a community, whatever that community is, has decided to learn and grow together. So you're helping your fellow community members unlearn some things that they might find that they're not aware of. One that I experience is like ableism. So you're not aware that maybe that belief is ableist. So I'm just gonna say like, hey, that's not cool to believe that. It's also much easier to call out things that you have lived experience of than things you don't. And it can feel good. You're attempting to make a better community. So by me saying, again, the example I've been using, the white girl dread example, that person's a member of my community, and I'm attempting to make a better community by telling them that, hey, just so you know, like, that's a very controversial hairstyle you've decided to have, and here's why. And engaging them publicly, the understanding is that hopefully it will have a snap to it, and this gets into the cons, that your fellow community members can see that you're doing something about it, can see. So that gets into the cons. A con of call-out culture or cancel culture is that it's so public, and it can have a performative aspect to it. So I can feel like I'm doing something good, but I'm also doing it so other people can see me do it. And I can win like allied brownie points. It's not necessarily doing the labor of building a better community. It's making me look good and feel good. And what it can get into, the biggest con I witness, experience, and see, and is really coming out, and I'll post a great talk about it, a simple talk about it, is it creates an ironically oppressive environment. And it can go into a couple things. One is oppressive Olympics. So my social location, I belong to communities that are not as dominant as you. I'm a disabled queer woman of color, and I have a harsher life experience than you. And what it does is it brings these social locations into spaces where, yes, that person definitely has a lived experience that can teach the dominant culture so much, but it can create this ironically oppressive environment, or people just being really afraid to say anything or do anything, so they don't seem woke enough, they don't seem radical enough, and there isn't really a space to create mistakes if every time you post something You're afraid that someone's going to come and like personally attack you for it. And that's a huge con of call out culture, is people aren't taking risks and trying things out on both sides because there isn't space to learn. If you're going to be publicly outed as ableist, racist, again, the Dread Girl example, so if someone wasn't so kind in their call out, that person gets labeled as racist, and they go to a party and people don't talk to them because they're that racist girl with dreadlocks. Again, this is just a simple a fictional example, but all of a sudden you have a culture where people are like, oh man, ooh, it's not conducive to learning. I believe, very few people learn from being shamed. Just a fact. People get defensive, and the shame just kind of burrows into their body, and then they're not building community, they're shying away, they're afraid, they're this. And that is a huge con of call-out culture. The other thing I want to say is that it really bakes into a umbrella problematic idea that if people just learn, and it has a sense of superiority. So white dread girl just doesn't know that her dreads are problematic. So if I just teach her, she'll know, and then she'll change. And sometimes this is totally true. Like, I have loads of biases, growing up in rural Canada. I definitely have rural biases regarding race, because I didn't grow up around a diversity of culture and things like that, and there's so many things like that. I'm just using my lived example. So there's definitely spaces I want to learn. And please, by the way, call me out, teach me, but please call me in too. So this sense of like, if you just learn, has a degree of superiority, and I think this is the biggest thing. If you take away anything from this, your Trump supporter uncle, or in Alberta, your Wexit cousin, they're not interested in learning about your liberal point of view. If you come in and call them out, it depends why you're doing that, really, and why I brought up the neo-Nazi aspect. Like, that is intolerable behavior. We need to be anti-fascist to keep the culture diverse. But if you just learn, sense of superiority won't land with all people, and something we really have to address, because it's a puzzle. If you've spent a lot of time educating yourself and unlearning maybe some problematic habits, but yeah, it can backfire for you, for sure. And the biggest thing from Sarah Schulman, what she speaks about, is that the online communication really keeps it very narrow. So it's very easy to quickly call someone abusive and shun them and not actually build repair culture, especially online. So how can you bring your conflicts off the screen into real life with people and understand that there's nuance in our conversations? I know I've found this, in anyone who's done customer service, people can be really vicious through social media or email, and when you get them in person, they're generally not as vicious because they see you in person. So it's so much easier, and it's so much easier to call someone a bleepity bleep online than it is in person. And I've generally found this. Lately I've been grieving not being the festival box office manager for the Fringe. And I'm so used to people just like yelling at me via email or being very intent on their perspective of what I should do. And in person, they're not like that. They don't have the same hostility. Some do, but it's very rare. So yeah, this call-out culture of making someone's mistakes so public doesn't allow for nuance. It doesn't allow a lot of space for people to learn and grow. And also, another really important key part of this is it can become a trauma response. And Sarah Schulman really breaks this down in Conflict is Not Abuse. So people being so insistent on their idea of a story being the right story is a way of themselves, their body and their mind, and their reality, making sense of perhaps trauma. And so this response of like, I'm right, my idea is absolutely right and your idea is wrong, can, not always, but can really underpin a sense of trauma. So when someone comes at you and says, your comment is abusive and kind of all this quite harsh language, it can be a trauma response for them that they need their story and their lived reality reinforced by other people. And so part of healing, which I don't recommend doing solely on your own, is getting people, interpersonal people, but also a community, to a space where there can be diverse perspectives, there can be diverse stories and understandings of what's happening. And in call-out culture, you won't get this right away because it's so public and it becomes so right, wrong, black, white. There isn't a lot of space always for nuance. And this kind of gets back to the communication part that I spoke about a couple weeks ago. So if you're really owning your own lived experience and your own perspectives, you may not be putting that, I'm going to use the word supremacy. And I should say, when I say supremacy, I don't mean Ku Klux Klan. I mean the innate cultural aspects, and I'm going to use North America, that we can't deny this. Like, the government of Canada was designed, built for, and maintained for me and my ancestors, for white settlers. And it's shifted since the 1960s, but there's a whole like 100, 200 years where it's very designed not for everyone, and especially not for Indigenous people. The opposite. So that's the pros and cons of call-out culture. Is there any questions about that? I'll give a couple minutes, and I'll also write the resources in here. Any questions? So, oh, and I'll post the YouTube, which is pretty great. So this is Ashiat Akambi, who's British, and just a really succinct clip on cancel culture and alternatives, and she speaks about this more succinctly than I do, without the examples as much. But just a quick thing about alternatives to call-out culture. So if someone calls you out, some questions that I kind of gathered in looking the activist research on YouTube and on blogs and things like that, is to look at, why are they aggressive? What's happening for them that's making this so aggressive for them? And trying to cut through the aggression and see what they're really trying to say. What are they attempting to get across? And why? And what can you learn from it? So if, again, I'll use the example I keep pulling up. You're on Instagram and someone says, you know, is a white girl with dreads, and you're saying your dreads are problematic, and maybe you say it like, you're perpetuating white supremacy with your dreads. You should really cut them off. And that woman sees it as aggressive, so she might be really mean back, and then you find yourself in an online fight. So really, in the call out, in any conflict, which is hard to do at the time, but what is that person attempting to say and why? Through their aggression, where does that aggression come from? And another really key thing to me is the use of power. And this gets into the cons and the Sarah Schulman theories about conflict not being abusive. So if someone, my experience is, if someone has been marginalized for most of their life for things that are they can't do things about. And Ferrari talks about this too. So if someone's only ever known power around power over, and we will talk about this in another thing, someone's asked me to talk about power. If it's only ever been power over, they've only ever had people have power over them, and they've always been under. Let me use both my hands, not my coffee. So, cops, Aish, court, child services, and they're here, and this keeps happening to them. Their parents, colleges, bosses. Then when they have any sense of power, which anti-oppression can often, I know when I first learned it, it made me feel so empowered to talk about the ways that I'd been oppressed, and to go out and call out problematic behavior. But what can happen is then it becomes a power over scenario. So this person becomes this person. And what is the use of power? So if someone's calling you out, are they trying to have power over you? Can you hear their message through the words? Can you address that and be accountable for the root of what they're trying to do versus maybe some of the other aspects that are less nuanced? And a solution that's been found and written about a lot is calling in instead of calling out. And so what call in culture is an alternative to the public, this, which again, I need to keep repeating, with some people, it may be absolutely necessary. With really harmful and dangerous views to other people, calling them out and doxing them may be the only solution, maybe. But calling in focuses on the relationship. So in my white dread example, I see her post something, I think it's, a little bit problematic. So I privately message her and say like, hey, I'm Brooke, I've seen you around a little bit. I just want you to know your message can be perceived in a problematic way, and maybe you want to change. So it becomes non-accusatory. It's you really valuing your relationship with that person and just giving a heads up and an alternative point of view to something they're saying and happening. It can be intense emotional labor. And so we have to ask who is saying this and why. And with call-out culture, you're probably not valuing the relationship very much, and you don't have to. It's a stranger. It's some rude blah blah blah, I'm trying not to swear, on the internet. And you just need to let them know they're a rude blah blah blah. Cool. But calling in is that labor and really valuing a relationship and someone's humanity. And it's really centered on the fact that we're all learning. So it's that private message saying like, hey, I'm learning just to let you know this is a point of view about your lifestyle choices or your point of view, or just to let you know that's privileged. And the intention behind calling in is staying curious. So do you really mean to say that? Because you're coming across as whatever. And just checking in. I'm like, are you aware that you saying that comes across this way? And it's creating a space of co-learning. So you privately are asking them, why did you post that? What is your intention around that statement? And really that accessibility and co-learning. It's staying curious. And something that the YouTube post, Ashiat Akambi, I hope I pronounced her name right, says, and I agree with this, if you're a hypocrite, it's okay, it means you're learning. So you said one thing and you changed your mind. Have we create spaces where people can change their mind? Where people don't have to be accountable for sure, for something they may have believed before, but how do we create space where people can change? And I think calling in really allows that. So, hey, just to let you know, I like you and I don't like what you said. And so being a hypocrite and changing your points of view mean that you're learning. And so calling in and kind of doing some of that personal work allows people to learn and change and grow privately, not publicly, in a space that can be filled with shame, and, you know, walking into a party and everyone hates this person. So how can we call people in? And the issue with calling culture is it can really be very heavy emotional labor. And emotional labor is when you don't lash out. It comes from an 80s academic, and the best way I think of classic emotional labor is flight attendants. So flight attendants have to be smiley and polite and kind, and traditionally they have been assaulted or harassed, or people are nasty, and they still have to like put a smile on their face and be like, please don't touch me. And so that's emotional labor. It came from people's careers where they had to continually be emotionally positive and consistent, even when people weren't, or personally they would not be that way. And so calling in does ask the person doing the labor of saying it's problematic to maintain positivity and check their emotions and be calm so the other person can learn. And so call-in culture, and same with call-out culture, it can't be for everyone, and same with circles. So this is where having people or community is really important. You're not alone, and really checking in with yourself and your self-advocacy. So with the disability culture, because I'm someone who has an immense amount of privilege in the able-bodied world, I'm really happy to do that labor. I'm really happy to do that education and talk about language and tools and ableist society, whereas someone else may not. Someone else who's constantly experiencing the violence of the system may not want to politely tell someone that their comment is ableist. And that's okay. That's really okay. That doesn't have to be your job. And so this is why community care and having community that has these conversations, and Sarah Schulman talks about this, instead of shunning, how can we hold nuance for our communities? And with that, I would say we need to define our communities. So who do you hold nuance for, and who don't you? And maybe the person on the Fox News website in the comments you don't hold nuance for. And maybe the person that you live with, or the person on your street, or the person that you consider your friend, or your friend's friend, you do hold nuance for. And this is something that you decide for yourself. Is when do you just directly call people out, and when do you try to build a relationship with them and do that? And I kind of here in the last moment, I'll say, my master's thesis that Robertson Wesley graciously supported and held space for and did some of the publicity and that kind of thing, was really me attempting to hold nuance for, in anti-oppression languages, the dominant culture. So cisgendered, heterosexual, white men, to learn about the Me Too movement and to learn about these gendered concepts. Unfortunately, they're seen as female, so that men could really learn and have this nuanced understanding. And it was key to me to kind of explore some of this. How do you talk about this and build relationships so men can be humans and learn and have mistakes? And I guess it was important for me to explore this. And so that's something that I took on in my social location, to hold space for, I think, how many months? From October to March, for men to learn, for men to build community, for men to talk about this. Do I expect everyone to do that? No. Am I a saint for doing it? No. I just saw an opportunity and wanted to try something. And so you may have spaces, again, where you're calling people out. You may have spaces where you're calling people in. And yeah, that's call in and call out culture. And I'm aware that, so the next one, and the Zoom link is in there, is about biases and expectations. So what do we expect of people? What are our biases? And then I think the one after that will be about power, because power keeps coming up for me in the conflict lectures that I've been doing. And it's interesting, I would love this actually. If you have any resources about power, please share them with me because I haven't seen that much. And so maybe I need to be interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary and find it in HR or business or leadership, which I'm suspicious of that word depending where it comes from. But power, how does power work? Because it keeps coming up too. So this was my lecture on calling in and calling out and the pros and cons of both. And yeah, what are you attempting to get across? What world are you attempting to build? And with who and how and why? And how do you feel good about moving through the world? So this was a classic lecture. Again, not my preferred way of working, but seems to be good for Facebook Live, and as I've been telling people in the real life, talking into the black hole of the internet. So thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions, you can privately message me through the Spirited Arts Movement. You can email me at brooke@rwuc.org. You can privately Facebook message me. You can write it in the comments. I just want to hear from you. I also want to be called out and called in. So if I'm saying something that is problematic to you, please let me know. I like having those conversations. I mean, it's a place of unlearning and relearning for us all. Have a great week. I hope you're doing okay with COVID. I hope you're doing okay with the world. Yeah, it's been an interesting dumpster fire of a year, and it doesn't look like it's getting better. Conversation for another day. Bye.